Thanks for coming back. This is question number 2 of the Summa Theologia. We're in prima pars, question 2. And as you can see up there above me, this begins a new treatise. And there are a lot of treatises in the Summa. Remember, question 1 was its own treatise on sacred doctrine. And now we have the treatise on the one God. Now, unlike the first treatise, this is going to be 25 questions, and it's very, very logical, and it flows very well from the treatise on sacred doctrine, where Thomas basically says, we are natural, but we have a supernatural aspect to us. We have a supernatural end, and so in order for us to know where we're going, we need sacred doctrine to tell us about those things that surpass our reason. I do want to mention also that I mentioned how he makes a distinction between faith and reason, between the natural and the supernatural. But unlike some philosophers, St. Thomas Aquinas did not think that these were incompatible. Okay, everything in reason would be compatible with faith, and the two really go together very nice. And there's never going to be a conflict between faith and reason, according to St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa. Okay, so let me get that out of the way right away. The treatise on the one God is going to begin in question 2 talking about the existence of God. And this is so very fundamental, because if Aquinas can't lay out proofs for the existence of God, well, the whole rest of the Summa is going to be meaningless, because the entire Summa is about man's coming from God and returning to God, as I'll explain in the next graphic a little bit more explicitly. Before he goes into question 2 and this new treatise, there is a little paragraph that Thomas adds at the beginning of it. And I want to read this because I think it's very important. He says, "Because the chief aim of sacred doctrine is to teach the knowledge of God, not only as he is in himself, but also as he is the beginning of things and their last end, and especially of rational creatures, as is clear from what has been already said," okay, in the first question. "And therefore, in our endeavor to expound this science," remember from the last question, "we shall treat of God, of the rational creatures' advance towards God, of Christ, who as man is our way to God." Okay, in that paragraph right there, Aquinas is laying out the master plan of what the Summa is going to do, okay? He's going to talk about God, he's going to talk about the rational creatures' return to God, and it's all going to culminate in tertia pars, the last part of the Summa, in the incarnation, Jesus Christ, and also the Eucharist, the last full section that Thomas writes before he decides to stop writing the Summa was on the Eucharist. And I don't think that's a coincidence, okay? You often hear theologians and philosophers, when they're talking about the Summa Theologia, there's this thing called exitus and reditus. Okay, what it means is that, in a sense, all creation exits from God, ex nihilo, okay? He creates the world. He creates everything, right? Including us. And then he draws us back to himself. And I have always thought that the boomerang is a great example, because the boomerang's very purpose is to return to that person who threw it out, right? In fact, it's designed to do that. Okay, we are designed with a nature to return to God. And if we don't return to God, ultimately in beatitude, it's only because of a misuse of our free will. Okay, so more on that as we get closer to it. All right, there's only 3 articles in this question number 2 of the Summa Theologia. And the first one, remember, this is about the existence of God. And he says whether the existence of God is self-evident. Now, you're probably thinking, who is in that picture? Who is that? This is a picture I found of St. Anselm receiving his crozier. Now, he lived before St. Thomas Aquinas. He is the author of the famous ontological argument. If you're familiar with that, I'll explain it here in just a moment. So self-evidence is innate. What it means that God's existence would be self-evident is that would we know that God exists simply through human reason alone, what's called a priori, before experience, before we see the world, before we have any kind of sense experience of the world, would we just naturally know mentally that God exists without having experienced anything? Now, the Platonists, like, Plato and the Neoplatonists, would say yes, because they believed in innate ideas. Plato believed that we're born with everything in our mind, and then we just go out and we experience the shadows in the world, and that just it recalls things that are already in our mind. Okay, Thomas was more Aristotelian when he felt that you had to experience the world. You had to go out, and you're going to come to know God through the experience of the natural world. St. Anselm had the famous ontological argument, which basically argued that God was that which nothing greater could be conceived. All right, that was his definition of God. And then he says, okay, if God is that which nothing greater can be conceived, well, that's an idea in the mind, and the reality of that idea would be even greater than just the concept in the mind. And therefore, since that would be greater than that which nothing greater could be conceived, God is real. All right. St. Thomas Aquinas, in this article, the Summa, says, I don't think so. Okay. He doesn't buy the ontological argument of St. Anselm, but it's very, very famous, and it's been debated and discussed for a long time. All right, so you might want to get to know the ontological argument. But the most important thing to know about this article is that Thomas does not believe that God's existence is self-evident. He thinks it's dependent upon our experience of the world, which leads into article number 2. He now says whether it can be demonstrated that God exists. And for this, he says yes. And he talks about, remember, a priori means before sense experience. A posteriori is when we know an effect, okay, like example, if you were at a bowling alley and you saw this scene, okay, there it is, you would assume, well, somebody threw that ball, right? There was some cause that created this scene. Or if you came across, footprints in the snow out in a cabin, some winter, you would presume that some animal walked by. Okay, so this is what Thomas is getting at is he's like, we see the world is really well designed. The world clearly calls for a creator, a cause, and that's going to be one of the proofs that we're going to talk about here in a second as well. So Thomas does not believe in self-evidence. It's not self-evident, but it is demonstrable. Okay, that's very important as we move through these articles. The final article of the second question of the Summa Theologia is, prima pars, first part, second question, article 3. And this is the most famous article in the entire Summa. This is where St. Thomas Aquinas gives his 5 proofs for the existence of God, the 5 ways, the 5 proofs. And again, this has been talked about and discussed and argued and debated for a long time. And they're very interesting. Thomas, for the most part, took them from Aristotle, okay? But Aristotle's God is very different than St. Thomas Aquinas' Christian God, for reasons we'll explain another time. But Thomas took the basic framework of Aristotle's proofs for God, and then he kind of baptized them and made it compatible with Christianity, all right? Because he was not going to accept anything that didn't agree with Christianity. So real quickly, without a lot of explanation, the 5 proofs for the existence of God is the unmoved mover, okay? That there is something that had to start the cycle of movement, because we see that things are moving in the world, and you go all the way back, there had to be an unmoved mover. Also an uncaused cause, okay? There has to be some principle of causality that created this long chain of cause and effect. The third one is possibility and necessity. He says everything in the world, including you and me and the dogs and the cats, they're just possible. They don't have to exist. If they didn't exist, it was okay. And at one point they didn't exist. And this calls for something that's necessary. And he says this necessary thing, surprise, surprise, is God. The fourth one is it's based on degrees of perfection, okay, degrees of being, where we see in the world we're constantly judging things according to degrees of perfection, okay. Some things are more perfect than others, some things are more beautiful, some things are taller, shorter, smarter. And he's saying, well, if we have some maximum on all these perfections, there must be some being that is the perfection of all perfections, all right? And it's God. And then the final fifth one is the governance of the world. And he says, look out in the world, and there's things, beavers building dams, or birds building nests, or ants mounds, and the world is ordered. And creatures that don't have intelligence are acting in such a way as to an end. And he said, how can they act for an end if they don't have intelligence themselves? There must be some intelligence behind it. This is sometimes called the argument for intelligent design. I like to call it governance of the world. Also, it's called the teleological argument, as opposed to the cosmological argument, which has to do with the ordering of the world. So their cosmological argument, teleological argument are the ones that these are typically referred to. Okay, so that is the second question of the Summa. I hope this is making sense, because tomorrow we're going to get into the beginning of what are called the 7 attributes of God. And I'll tell you right now, we'll go more into this tomorrow, is that he's going to spend 9 questions talking about 7 attributes of God. Why would he do that? There's a very important reason, and I will explain that in the coming days. Thank you for watching. God bless you.